reading the whole Bible this year. Today is day 170, and we are reading the first 6 chapters of Ecclesiastes. So let's go. Starts off by telling us who it is that is speaking or writing these things, and all signs point to it's probably Solomon. It doesn't come out right and say Solomon. It refers to himself as the teacher, but it says this in verse 1, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. The other indicators about the king here seem to imply that he was king over all of Israel. There's only one son of David who was king over all of Israel, and that's Solomon, because after him, his son breaks up the kingdom and it becomes 2 kingdoms. So it's probably Solomon. It's always been attributed to Solomon. Most scholars think it was Solomon. It was probably Solomon. Starts off like this. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile or meaningless. Everything is meaningless, depending on your translation. Basically, he looks and he says, everything is meaningless. And so the whole first chapter is going to kind of go there and just point out like everything goes away. Everything fails to last. Everything in this world fades. It's a vapor. It's a mist. It's worthless. It's meaningless. It doesn't last. And these are the things. Remember who this is writing. This is probably Solomon writing at the end of his life. This is the king who asked God for wisdom, not for riches, not for wealth, not for power, not for women, not for victories. He asked for wisdom that he could lead well. Then what did he do? Apparently, he squandered it. He's looking for real deep meaning, and he can't find it anywhere. At the end of the book, not today, but at the end of chapter 12, we're going to find out what really does carry some meaning. We get hints of it as we go through, but what we find are some categorical places where this king who had everything, because God blessed him with absolutely everything he could want. And he says, I chased pleasure and it didn't get me anywhere. I tried even wisdom, ultimately doesn't sustain, doesn't last. He's like, I can't fix the world just by being wise. He says, I said to myself, see, I've amassed wisdom far beyond all those who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly. I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. It's all just chasing the wind. And the NIV says, this is the CSB I'm reading from. He says, for with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases, because the more you know, the more you realize the futility of everything, how much it doesn't last. Ultimately, our lives are so short. Our legacies are not guaranteed. The changes that we put into effect in this world may or may not last. They often don't. And even so, everything's going to keep happening. There's nothing new under the sun. The cycle is going to continue. Humanity is still broken and fallen. What he notices is everything this world has to offer falls horribly, terrifyingly, and depressingly short. So chapter 2, he gets into pleasure. He says, okay, I tried pleasing myself. I tried everything I could. I got possessions. I tried women. I tried parties. I tried absolutely everything that I could do to do that. Comes back to, okay, so I went back to wisdom. That made me come back to wisdom. I turned to consider wisdom, madness and folly. This is verse 12 of chapter 2. He says, what will the king's successor be like? He will do what has already been done. And I realize there is an advantage to wisdom over folly, like the advantage of light over darkness. Even then, he says, still, even though somebody will take over for me and somebody else will inherit this, and even if they're wise, it doesn't make my life infinite. Everything I do is going to be forgotten. Everything is futile and a pursuit of the wind. He says, what about work? We do work and then we do all of this. And then in the end, it still needs to be done. None of this stuff lasts. Whatever work you're doing has to be done again. Somebody else has to go to work tomorrow. After you die, somebody else has got to take your place. It just keep all that to say, don't get depressed. But as he goes through these things, as he looks at now in chapter 3, the mystery of time, there was that classic song, right? Like, in every season, turn, turn, turn. Yeah. There's a time for everything. And he gives all these, contrasting statements, right? There's a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant, time to uproot, time to kill, time to heal, time to tear down, time to build, and so on and so forth. And still in that, while there is time for everything, it still doesn't quite solve the problem that he's trying to put together here, that he's trying to collect all these pieces and and build something meaningful. And ultimately, it keeps falling apart. It's like building a house of cards. The slightest just falls apart. He talks about the mystery of injustice and death. He talks about everything that he can find. And he talks about even being extremely wealthy. And he says it's lonely there, though. There's a utility to it, but there's a futility to it. It starts pointing toward chapter 5 here. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. And so he says, okay, like pointing toward God, maybe this is the way to wisdom. And then he finds futility there because he says, now you risk getting yourself in trouble. Don't make foolish vows. Don't get yourself into something. It'd be better not to vow anything to the Lord than to make a vow that you cannot or do not intend to keep. And then he comes back to wealth and he says, look, the reality of wealth is it doesn't last, and there's oppression of the poor. And if you're really wealthy, then somebody else is lacking often. And, he's sort of looking at it like it's a zero-sum game. And he acknowledges that hard work does bring some satisfaction, but it still falls short because it has to keep being done. And so the best you can do is find satisfaction in having done an honest day's work, in a job well done, in having worked hard. And yet it's chasing wind and it's futile. And he goes all the way through chapter 6, talking through that. 7 of chapter 6, all of a person's labor is for his stomach, yet the appetite is never satisfied. So what advantage then does the wise person have over the fool? What advantage is there for the poor person who knows how to conduct himself before others? Better what the eyes see than wandering desire. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. And he basically looks ahead and he goes, but what's going to come next? Nothing we do is going to guarantee what happens next. And that's the thing, is like we'll see at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, but even as we read through this today, I do want to encourage you, don't let this convince you that everything is truly meaningless. This is the lament, the extended processing of, it's like the first couple lines of the song, Graves into Gardens. I searched the world and it couldn't fill me. Man's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough. And that's a summation of Ecclesiastes. The wisest man in the world becomes the richest man in the world. He chases women, he chases money, he chases entertainment, and it all falls flat because he's walked away from God. And that's what's missing in all of this. And he finds even self-serving attempts at appealing to God fall short to people. Later in the book, he's going to really bring it around to where that really lands as he comes back to the Lord. And that's the key. Everything in this world is fruitless, is temporary, and is ultimately meaningless if we do not have a relationship with our Creator and a saving faith in Jesus the Christ. And so I just want to encourage you that whatever it is that's distracting you, whatever it is that's got your heart, whatever it is that has your attention, nothing in this world will fully sustain or satisfy you if it doesn't start and end with Jesus. That's where I'm reminded and challenged and encouraged today, because I do know Christ, and I hope you do too. If you don't, let's talk about that. If you have other thoughts, questions, concerns after reading this, let's talk about that in the chat here or in the Bible app. Join us on there. In the meantime, keep reading and praying your way through this, and be rad for Jesus.